before McCloskey can put forward her understanding of economics as a form of rhetoric, she first has to unseat the current ruler, Modernism, and that's what she does in part 3 of her 1983 article. So, what McCloskey does here is basically has a series of subsections in which she attacks modernism from a variety of different positions. So the first one is modernism is obsolete in philosophy. So what's the problem identified within philosophy itself? Well, the argument goes that it has an internal contradiction at its heart. And that contradiction is that its hostility to quote-unquote metaphysics is itself quote-unquote metaphysical. And this is an attack which is made on logical positivists. Remember that the logical positivists said that either a proposition has to be a definition, that is, it's something which is true by definition, or a proposition has to be true by virtue of observed facts about the world through sense experience. And if it's neither of those, if a proposition is neither of those, then they call that metaphysical. It's beyond the material world which we can observe. And in that case, you should chuck it. But think about this proposition itself. Is it true by definition? No. Is it true by means? Do we know it to be true by sense experience? Well, no. So that would seem to imply that this proposition itself is, by the positivist understanding, metaphysical. And if that's true, then the positivists should chuck out their own key philosophical position. This is obviously contradictory. It won't fly. We should be saying there's something wrong at the heart of it and we should probably give it up. McCloskey says, now think about famous economists when they put forward their methodological propositions, how they say economics is to be done. These two are what she calls metaphysical prejudices. Thus, by their own professed standards, and here we have to assume that they're holding to the idea that the same positivist idea that either something is true by definition or it's true by observation. By their own standards, they should throw their own methodological pronouncements into the flames as meaningless also. So I think of, say, from Milton Friedman's 1953 essay, The Methodology of Positive Economics. It makes a series of claims in that, such as the goal of the goal of science is prediction. You choose between theories based on which one is better able to predict phenomena of interest. And if you have two theories which predict equally well, then one must choose the theory that is simpler and more fruitful. Okay, so there's a set of propositions. Are they true by definition? No. Are they true as per observation? That is, can we just observe facts in the world and see these things, these methodological statements as facts in the world? No. Well, in that case, these methodological statements are themselves, in inverted commas, metaphysical, and if we're being good positivists, we should just chuck them out. In which case, Friedman's methodology should be chucked out as metaphysical, meaningless nonsense. B. Falsification is not cogent or is not plausible, convincing. Falsification here this is coming from Karl Popper in his book, The Logic of Scientific Discovery. Well, at least that's what most people think anyway. So, the notion of falsification is pretty straightforward. You have a theory, it makes a prediction about the world. That prediction could be true or false. If, when you observe the world under the right conditions, blah, 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 you find that the prediction is not true, then you have falsified your theory. You've shown that your theory is not true. Now, McCloskey is saying this doesn't fly in economics or in science more generally. What reasons does she give for thinking that? One is the Duhem-Quine problem, which undermines the attempts to falsify hypotheses. The Duhem-Quine problem, it's called that because Pierre Duhem and Willard Quine separately stated the same problem. And the problem is this, that a theory doesn't consist of just one proposition, which will either be true or false depending on whether the prediction it makes is true or false. Rather, a theory is really a collection, or any attempt to falsify a theory involves a collection of different hypotheses together. So you don't, let's say take the case of, what's a classic case, is the motion of the planets. You don't predict the motion of the planets based purely on Newton's law of universal gravitation. Rather, you need Newton's law of universal gravitation, Newton's second law of motion, which is force equals mass times acceleration, plus the hypothesis that all other forces other than gravitation that might be in existence are negligible, will have a negligible effect on the planets. And you'll also need some auxiliary assumptions or beliefs or hypotheses as well. One might be, you need to say, well, we're assuming there's this many planets. We know there are this many planets. You don't want to have the number of planets wrong. Otherwise your calculations are going to be off. Another auxiliary assumption is that your instruments and the methods of observation you're using give you accurate readings. And furthermore, those, say for example, the instruments you're using to observe planetary motion themselves will have theories behind them. So the telescopes that you might be using are backed by a theory of optics. So you've got to assume the theory of optics you're using is right as well. And then there's, you could say, a final auxiliary assumption that you've got to make is that your calculations have been done correctly. All right, so all of those things together generate a prediction. Now, let's say that prediction about the motion of, a sighting of Venus or something like that in the night sky turns out to be wrong. Does that mean that you've proved that, or you've falsified Newton's law of universal gravitation? Or does it mean that you've falsified Newton's second law of motion? Or does it mean that you've falsified the hypothesis that all the other forces other than gravity are negligible? Or have you falsified the auxiliary assumption about the number of planets that there are? Or have you falsified the auxiliary assumption that your instruments and methods of observation are accurate and working properly, and that the theories underlying those instruments and methods are themselves true? Which one of these, or is it all of them? Is it some of them? Is it just one of them that has been falsified? You don't really know. So that's a reason for thinking that, oh, the simple story about falsification is just not right. McCloskey also says that the probabilistic nature of hypotheses means that there are no truly crucial tests that can definitively falsify a hypothesis. Let's say we had a really, really simple hypothesis. So let's try and get rid of the Duhem-Quinn problem. So we got a really simple hypothesis. And the really simple hypothesis says that any given person who smokes has a 70% chance of developing lung cancer. So we've got a patient comes in and they're a smoker, and we'd say, okay, so there's a 70% chance that they'll get lung cancer. So I would predict that this person is going to get lung cancer before someone who doesn't smoke, the next patient who comes in who doesn't smoke. Okay, so that's my prediction. Now, let's say for this person, they don't get lung cancer. Did I falsify my hypothesis that there's a 70% chance that a person will get lung cancer, that this person will get lung cancer? But did we show that they didn't really have a 70% chance? Maybe it's true that they had a 70% chance of getting lung cancer and they just got lucky. So the fact that this is a probabilistic hypothesis means that you can't just do a one-off crucial test, so to speak, that says, aha, we've proved our hypothesis wrong. What about prediction? McCloskey says prediction is impossible in economics. McCloskey says that predicting the future is beyond our capacities. Now, she doesn't offer often philosophers of science who also hold that prediction is impossible in economics will offer elaborate metaphysically based or ontologically based reasons for thinking that you can't make predictions in economics. But McCloskey doesn't make any kind of elaborate argument like that. She makes an argument that's kind of like what you might expect, almost a caricature of an economist to say, which is we know that economists can't predict, or economists can't predict the future, because if they could predict the future, then as rational, self-interested agents, they would keep this secret to themselves and use it to make millions of dollars on the stock market or something like that, or the futures market. But in fact, they don't. So we know that that's pretty unlikely that they're really able to make predictions about the future. The economists' predictions are no better than normal market returns. So there's nothing special about economists or economics' capacity to predict the future. That's the basic argument she makes. A kind of a simpler version of that is that you should always be suspicious of the bald man who's trying to sell you a hair growth tonic. If the hair growth tonic really worked, then why is this guy still bald? All right. And anyway, we shouldn't fetishize prediction because it doesn't really define science. It's not a defining characteristic of science. So Darwinian theory, the Darwinian theory of natural selection, didn't make predictions in the normal sense that we think of predictions. But no one said that the Darwinian theory of natural selection wasn't science. Well, very few people said it wasn't science. Modernism is itself is impossible and is not followed. Modernist precepts are so strict that if really adhered to, no one could honestly claim to know anything. Cartesian and Humean methods of doubt destroy almost all claims to certain knowledge. If we say, for example, we'll take David Hume and the problem of induction. So induction is where you observe a very wide variety of phenomena, and if you see a pattern in your observations, then you can make an inductive inference about the future, or to unobserved instances of that phenomenon. So if you see A following A followed by B, A followed by B repeatedly, then you're willing to say, well, in other unobserved cases, A will be followed by B in the future or in other scenarios from the past. But Hume says, well, how do you know that for sure? Do you actually observe the future? No. What's the basis for our inference that the future will be like the past? Or that the unobserved patterns, or the unobserved will be like the observed patterns? On what basis can we make that inference? And he says we would have to make that inference based on an assumption called the principle of uniformity. That is, that nature is uniform, or the world is uniform in its patterns. We discover these patterns and the things we observe, and then we infer that. We can then say, well, that must be true everywhere else as well. And then he says, okay, but what's the basis for believing in this principle of the uniformity of nature? What's the basis for believing that? Well, you can't say it's true by definition. You can conceive of a world in which that were not true. Is it true by observation? Well, how would you know that it's true by observation? You would have to make an inductive inference about that principle itself. The problem here is that we're trying to justify our inductive inference by means of another inductive inference. Or in other words, we have to presuppose that which we're attempting to prove, which is circular. And if you've got a circular argument, generally speaking, no one believes that's a good argument at all. But at least Hume thought that we could be absolutely certain of our direct sensory experiences of the world. But now if we go to René Descartes, he would say, well, can we necessarily be certain of that? If we use a Cartesian method of doubt, we could say, well, is it conceivable that the experiences that I'm having now are illusory in some way? I mean, we know of cases where we've seen illusions. Everyone's seen magic tricks and we have no idea how it happened. There's an illusion at work. So is it possible that the observations, the direct sensory experiences that we're having now are in fact incorrect? Is it possible that we might even be dreaming, that these are not in fact experiences of the world at all, but it's simply an extremely vivid dream? Is that a possibility? Yes, that's possible. Or let's go one better than that. What if I do dream, but then I wake up and I can clearly say, well, that was a dream and now I'm awake. But let's say that in both of these cases, now that I'm awake, what if there was an evil demon who was creating a vast illusion in which everything we see and sense while we're awake is not really there at all. Is that conceivable? Well, today we would say, no, that's not conceivable, that's ridiculous. But Descartes would say, well, prove me wrong. You can at least conceive of it. You might not think it's very realistic, but you can at least entertain the possibility. There is a seed of doubt. And in which case, we would say we can't be absolutely certain even of our direct sensory experiences, let alone, as Hume said, projections into the future or into unobserved cases. Now, if our criterion for knowledge is that we are absolutely certain that our beliefs are true, then if we accept these the possibilities that are presented by Hume and Descartes, then we can't really say we've got certain knowledge of anything at all, or not much anyway. So the point is that if we held to the modernist standard of knowledge being guaranteed true belief, then even founding members of modernism had arguments. There were arguments at their disposal, or that others could use, which would destroy the foundations for any of this certain belief at all, any certain knowledge at all. And in that case, we can't really claim to know anything, but no one really takes it seriously. We can sensibly walk around the place saying, yes, I know that there is a chair in the room and I can sit in the chair and that's fine. No one doubts that. Or I have two hands. There's no doubt about that. Really, in practical terms. So it's not a standard which would be seriously followed. And in any case, the history of the sciences show that no one really adhered strictly to modernist precepts anyway. McCloskey goes on to say, in economics, in truth, crude experiments and big books own the day by their very crudeness and bigness. So here she's saying, when we look at the history of economics, we can see that no one was really following modernist rules of developing a theory based on all the available evidence, and then making a prediction and seeing if the prediction comes true, and then accepting or rejecting based on those observed findings. That's not how anything really happened. That's not how, for example, the Keynesian revolution came about, or the monetarist counter-revolution came about. Rather, says McCloskey, these revolutions and counter-revolutions came about by virtue of basically big books. So the Keynesian revolution, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money by John Maynard Keynes, which didn't have a lot of rigorous empirical backing to it at all, but nonetheless it took off and was believed strongly and by young economists, and increasingly and very quickly by the majority of economists, well before the evidence was in that it was even true. The monetarist counter-revolution, McCloskey says, probably has far more to do with Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz's book on a monetary history of the United States, a huge tome, than on any kind of rigorous, theoretically well spelt out explanation of what they were describing in detail in this large book. It was rather an elaborate empirical story that they were telling about the relationship between changes in the money supply and changes in the real economy that were convincing. So the argument would go. McCloskey also says there's a whole range of other developments in economics that just didn't follow the standard scientific method as laid down by positivists or a modernist approach. So she gives a list of examples here: cliometrics, general equilibrium theory from the 1950s, and the economics of law. Says none of these emerged because of this modernist scientific method being followed. Furthermore, it's not the case that you come to believe a theory after a vast accumulation of evidence which has established, which has verified or corroborated or confirmed the theory. Rather, what tends to happen in reality is that a theory and a belief in that theory's value exists before it's tested. Right? Now that may seem a bit crazy. Why would you believe a theory before you've tested it empirically to establish that it's true? McCloskey just says, well, that's how it's citing Ronald Coase. McCloskey says, well, that's just how it is. I mean, why else would people choose to test this or that theory out of a galaxy of possibilities? Of a zillion theoretical possibilities to explain any given phenomenon. Why this theory or that theory? The argument goes that it's because they care, because someone really cared. They've emotionally attached themselves to a particular theory. They care about this theory. They believe the theory is right. They have convictions about the theory, and they set out to defend that theory. And others who have a deep and abiding belief that the theory is wrong or bad or something like that, they set out to empirically destroy it. Okay? But people either believe it strongly or strongly disbelieve it before the testing occurs. And that's what motivates the testing, which is contrary to the standard modernist story. E. Any method is arrogant and pretentious. So McCloskey says that modern economic methodologists dictate what should count as good science, and usually they're going to be appealing to philosophers of science, and they steal ideas from the philosophers of science, and then they impose these dictates on economists and say this is what you have to do in order to be a true scientist. So McCloskey says this is not right. That presupposes an expertise of all science now and in the future, but that's clearly implausible. There's no way you can say what science is like everywhere and what it will be like in the future. And in any case, as has been previously discussed, modernism presupposes an impossible epistemology, a foundationalist epistemology where you have to have guaranteed true beliefs. So McCloskey here mentions as one of the naughty dictators a famous economic methodologist, Mark Blaau, who wrote this book in the 1980s and updated it periodically, The Methodology of Economics. This is a book that as an undergraduate I kind of quote-unquote grew up reading. It was a little bit of a Bible at the time. So why should we follow the dictatorship of such philosopher kings? There's no good reason to do that. We should just ignore them. Well, maybe not ignore them, but certainly we shouldn't take them too seriously. And she says that if we were to live under the dictatorship of these philosopher kings who would dictate how science should be conducted, then we'd be living in an authoritarian society, quote-unquote society of scholars, rather than an open society of scholars. And this is ironically, it's pinching a term from Karl Popper, who wrote the book The Open Society and Its Enemies. So, but McCloskey is saying is implying anyway, that the society of scholars should be an open society. That is, one which is not dictated to, which everyone does their own thing. Everyone tries their hand at whatever they feel might work for them. And then they submit it to their peers, who will then either have to be persuaded or not. But it's a matter of continuous negotiation in an open society where people are free to try things out for themselves. McCloskey says, rather, the proper business of methodology is an anarchistic one. So this is a term coming from Paul Feyerabend in his book Against Method, which was subtitled An Anarchistic Theory of Knowledge. And so the proper business of economic methodology is an anarchistic one. That is, one of resisting the rigidity and the pretensions of rules. That's the proper business. As to how that would be done is probably something McCloskey is going to suggest is exemplified in Rhetoric in the later parts of the article. Part F. Other sciences do not follow modernist method. So none of the sciences, including economics, really follow the textbook account of the scientific method. Even mathematics, which is supposedly the pinnacle of a science, if you want to call it that, a science which gets closest to achieving, supposedly gets closest to achieving absolute certainty, itself is not really built on solid foundations. Quoting from Davis and Hirsch from 1981, McCloskey notes, mathematical truth, like other kinds of truth, is fallible and corrigible. So people can make mistakes unknowingly, and they can make revisions to that. So what might seem like a certain truth in one particular moment in the history of mathematics turns out to have not been true at all. And this is a continual process within mathematics itself. There's always continuous revision. What was thought to be a proof is no longer a proof. The very notion of what counts as a proof can change over time. In paleontology, the predation explanation of the Cambrian explosion was not discovered or justified by modernist rules. Just as a side note, the predation explanation of the Cambrian explosion comes from, I think it's Stephen Stanley's. So, there's actually lots of explanations, but one of those explanations which McCloskey is referring to is this predation explanation, which goes that the emergence of predators led to rapid evolutionary changes in prey, so that they started to develop evolve in all sorts of weird and wacky ways that led to a proliferation of different species and subspecies in the Cambrian period. Anyway, the point is that wasn't discovered in the so says McCloskey, that wasn't discovered in the normal modernist way. The explanation was put forward on fairly scanty evidence from the fossil record and a very creative explanatory hypothesis was developed that wasn't itself well backed empirically in any way. All right, so we're continuing on here. Kuhn, Lakatos and Feyerabend have shown that the history of physics exhibits no simple universal method or eternally secured findings. So these are philosophers of science who took a historical turn, so to speak. So they started looking at the history of science, how in particular physics. They argued that each method, the supposed universal methods put forward by logical positivists or logical empiricists and by Popperian falsificationists, just weren't borne out by the historical evidence of how physics itself actually developed. And this idea that physics develops by simply accumulating more and more true facts about the world, which are accurately explained, and you have a given theory which simply gets augmented and improved slowly but surely. They sought to demonstrate that that's just nonsense, and that in fact theories get overthrown by entirely new theories, and those new theories entailed new kinds of discoveries which were impossible by the old theory, not just because they see the world differently or they look for different things in the world. A theory suggests to look for different things, but the existing facts themselves get reinterpreted. So an old fact is no longer thought of in the same way. It gets reinterpreted. In which case, can we really say we're just accumulating facts which everyone has agreed on since the year dot, and we're just building on it? No, the facts are being constantly reinterpreted, and some facts just get thrown out the window as being irrelevant at the end of the day. Anyway, so, and then the end point to this section F is, therefore, if economists should imitate other sciences, imitate even the majesty of physics and mathematics, there is, to be sure, considerable doubt that it should, then it should officially open itself to a wider range of discourse. Okay, so that's the general point that she's trying to make at the end of that. And so this is McCloskey's attempt to batter to death the modernist approach to doing science in general and economics in particular. It's at least to attempt to sow sufficient seeds of doubt in the mind of the reader that they should no longer have faith in this modernist approach, and so they should be now more amenable to the alternative which is coming in the next section.